everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Particularly Innovative, where we dive deep into the wide world of DeFi. My name is Mango. I'm the Executive Creative Director at Charged Particles, and I'm joined here by Ace, who is a core contributor for Velodrome. Really excited to chat with you today, and thanks so much for jumping on the show.
Thanks for having us. It's always good to connect with people face to face in DeFi in our digital world.
Right on, yeah. We're really excited about our partnership with Charged Particles and Velodrome and to help contribute to the mode ecosystem. So we'll dive into some of that in a little bit. But I just wanted to get started with, maybe some introductory conversation about Velodrome for people who might not be familiar with you guys and what you offer, why it's awesome. So I pulled from your website here that, Velodrome combines elements of Curve, Convex, and Uniswap. So what was the inspiration for this synthesis? What sort of advantages do you see by taking the best of all of those worlds and why these particular protocols?
Sure. So there's a bit of history with the whole DEX design, and that came from early 2022 when Andre Cronje first released Solidly. And Andre is obviously a crucial builder and innovator in DeFi, and not only has he designed a lot of things on his own, but he has respected some of the important core primitives that have helped kind of amass a large amount of TVL and improve security, increase accessibility for users across the world within DeFi. And he designed a DEX essentially with a better incentives design and model, and essentially tried to balance the system for all players involved. His original pilot didn't go as well as I think he had anticipated. However, it did generate a lot of excitement and interest, and many of those early participants, kind of took his open source code and decided to run with it and improve it or adapt it to a different strategy. So that's really what the Velodrome team initially did, was took the Velodrome the Solidly V1 code and deployed it on Optimism. And they were one of the very first, I would say, successful dApps to natively deploy on a Ethereum layer 2. And the way that it works really is that you've got a system that allows for protocols who are looking for deep liquidity for their token, which we all know is very important in DeFi, to essentially bootstrap a pool by crowdsourcing liquidity. So you help them achieve their liquidity desires while making LPs happy. And you also have this sort of intermediate layer that's voting to sort of direct emissions to the LPs. So rather than kind of disaggregating the various components of like Curve and Uniswap, Convex, we brought them all into a single house to ensure a better UX for users and also prevent any value leakage. So it seems like it's really had somewhat of a great success story since we launched in the middle of the bear market in 2022, sandwiched right between 3AC and Luna blowing up and FTX collapsing. So to see a team kind of build and succeed coming out of that is great. And in addition to that, there have been a lot of other VE33 Solidly adaptations that have launched across the various chains in DeFi. So we think we've got a really nice design going. And although it's been a couple of years for Velodrome, it's still very early in this whole, I would say, Solidly experiment.
Yeah, right on. You mentioned Optimism, and right on the front page of Velodrome, you talk about you being the superchain liquidity hub. Could you talk a little bit about why you think that's important? What the superchain is, and what your vision for interoperable DeFi is in general.
Yeah, we think Optimism has the best vision for how to scale Ethereum long term. And the two major components to scaling, if you think of blockchain in the context of where we've come from with Ethereum mainnet, it was slow and it got expensive, especially the more popular it got. Things were very congested and people struggled to get transactions through. They ended up wasting a lot of money. on failed transactions, and there's all sorts of issues with front running and MEV. And the layer twos essentially are there to help prevent those impacts, as well as increase adoption and accessibility to anyone. Fees should be immaterial. Transaction speed should be, it should feel the same as using an app on your phone or the internet today. It's like you click a button and you get a result. So Optimism is essentially providing that service. In addition, they're bringing a new component of Web3 and especially DeFi that has really not been unlocked yet, which is, like you mentioned, interoperability. And we've seen really awesome things happen with composability, where you can essentially have different LP tokens interact, and so you have this standardized token design with different protocols. So you can increase capital efficiency, you can make things a lot easier with a single push of a button, and a lot of composability things happen behind the scenes. But interoperability is something that we haven't quite unlocked at least in Ethereum. And what we imagine seeing through interoperability is a lot of these various chains being much more efficient with what their developers and their teams can do in terms of accessing liquidity. So if you have a token that can move across chains, you're essentially reducing a lot of risk and you're making things much more efficient. So there's no bridges involved. There's no wrapped versions of tokens. It's sort of this omni-chain within the Optimism superchain version of a token. And we see, as liquidity is sort of important to building out any DeFi ecosystem, Velodrome's design is there to facilitate the liquidity across all of these interoperable chains. Mm-hmm. So we're early, right? It's still in this sort of ideation concept spec phase, but the end goal is to really have all of the liquidity within the Velodrome network as the hub for various teams like yourselves to tap into, and makes things a lot easier to spin up and bootstrap.
Yeah, right on. The metaphor I sort of like is that, you wouldn't be able to fit everyone in the world in New York City. It's like you have a need for many major places like, Los Angeles and Dubai and London and all these places. And it's important just to make sure that there are highways connecting them and flights connecting them and digital platforms where they can interact with each other. It doesn't make sense to try to put everyone in one place. Interoperability, accessibility was another thing I heard you talking about. This is something that's obviously quite important for us. For a lot of people, DeFi is extremely complicated, even if you're an expert. And learning about a brand new ecosystem, getting involved in all the different platforms and that sort of thing is like can be quite complicated. Even just installing MetaMask is quite complicated for people. And that's why we're quite excited about Web3 Packs as an onboarding tool for people to get broad exposure to lots of platforms across, Mode as an example, of which Velodrome will be a key part in one of these first packs. And so accessibility and onboarding at the user level is what we're focusing on. So I wonder, in terms of accessibility, what your thoughts are, either for users or for the broader DeFi ecosystem. Or what other sorts of emerging trends do you think are critical in the development of DeFi?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on the kind of account abstraction, moving the experience from like a really steep learning curve with browser extension wallets and private keys and hardware wallets. It takes a real dedicated enthusiast to spend the time to get caught up on the onboarding process and comfortably navigating Web3. I myself have been in it since 2016, but if it was easy, you would see a lot more people doing it, and the adoption, much more beyond, say, the centralized exchanges, which have a lot of users, but we're looking at 2 orders of magnitude smaller numbers in DeFi still. So some of the things that we have noticed are a lot more, I would say, mobile users. And one of the things that I think is very, very cool is something that, the Coinbase smart wallet essentially is one of the biggest, I would say, innovations and onboarding mechanisms. Obviously, Base also part of the Optimism superchain, and they want to grow the adoption of the chain there. But their smart wallet essentially allows users to tap into the centralized exchange funds and interact with DeFi. So you're essentially removing the friction of having to change, assets from one wallet to another, change your UX from like a website that's really easy to, point and click move around like a centralized exchange into say, MetaMask, like you mentioned. So, simplifying that whole UX is like a huge, I would say, plus up for DeFi. So, I think a lot of these wallets are trying to tackle that sort of on-ramping friction. I've seen some pretty cool apps where it's just like, put your credit card in, you're funding a wallet. It could be custodial. I think that's one thing that we should probably stray away from is like those custodial type wallets. I think,
Mhm.
especially with what happened in the previous cycle. But Coinbase Smart Wallet's doing a good job of sort of making that non-custodial and then designing a UX that's more similar to like storing a password in your keychain, and I think that's a huge step forward. So yeah, that's probably the thing that sticks out the most for me.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to dive into just a few more features of Velodrome, and then maybe back to just a little bit broader thought leadership sort of questions. Could you talk a little bit about Velodrome's the concept of your flywheel, and some of the VE tokenomics model as well?
Yeah, I'll spend some time on that. I definitely see, like I mentioned, three sort of distinct players in our flywheel. And a flywheel is obviously like a generic term that you hear across a lot of different things in DeFi. But since Velodrome is, like a bike racing course, we actually do have wheels within our within our branding. So it fits in a couple ways. Um, so I'll start with liquidity providers and any as we know, like in DeFi, incentives drive liquidity. Liquidity isn't loyal. It's going to go to where it's most needed, and typically that's based on, what are the earning potential? What's the rewards you could be based on APR. So in the Velodrome system, liquidity providers are incentivized through an emission token. It's a utility token, which is known as Velo. And, essentially we have emissions that are scheduled on a weekly basis. And I'll help everyone understand kind of how those emissions get allocated. So every 7 days, there's a new epoch. And we have a voting layer. So anyone who has Velo tokens can lock those up. And in addition, in exchange for their locked Velo, they have a VE Velo NFT that has associated voting power or governance power, however you want to term it. And those voters essentially get to choose where to delegate their votes every week. And they can vote for every pool that's listed on our exchange. And obviously they're going to be incentivized to vote logically. So the higher the voting rewards they can receive, the more the pool is going to get in terms of their votes. And kind of the third component of this flywheel are the projects or protocols, and these are our liquidity partners. They come to us. We really see ourselves as sort of a B2B business in DeFi, but partners come to us and ask us to help them bootstrap liquidity. So if you have a new token and you're hoping to get like $1 million of TVL in your pool, there's a couple ways you can do that. Traditionally, people would will hire a market maker. They'll say, yeah, I just raised some money. I don't have enough to get the desired liquidity in DeFi, so I'm going to go out and ask a market maker to help me pair up my native token. They can provide the USDC or the wrapped ETH, whatever the base asset is, and they'll help me kind of build a pool and manage the liquidity. That can be very expensive, and it's definitely not for everyone. Especially our version of DeFi, which is much more, as I mentioned this before, accessible. We really take a lot of our inspiration from some of the early fair launched projects in DeFi. And we have a lot of partners that come to us with very little in the war chest. They say, we've got tokens, we want to get them out there, we want liquidity. And Velodrome really helps by directing them towards our incentivization strategy. So as I mentioned, the voters really decide where liquidity gets directed because of the Velo emission token. If you're a new project and you want to incentivize voters, you can deposit voting incentives that are available for those voters to get access to every week. So we typically see a really great benefit for early stage projects looking to bootstrap liquidity to the tune of about, for every dollar in deposited voting incentives, they can receive 1.5 to $2 in Velo tokens. So it's a very efficient way for them to provide incentives to achieving liquidity, and that helps get TVL up quite quickly. And the flywheel essentially comes down to the higher their pool gets in terms of TVL, the more they can incentivize the voters, and that directs additional Velo to that pool and creates a additional TVL as well. So that's kind of the basic model, is this three-party system, I guess. It's like you have your LPs, your voters, and your protocols that we partner with. Some of the most successful flywheel participants are those that not only are they incentivizing votes to get liquidity every week, but they also deposit their own protocol and liquidity. So some of the projects that come to us do have, a stable coin or wrapped ETH in their treasury, and they often pair that with their native token and deposit that into Velodrome. The advantage that they get is they'll also earn Velo token emissions for their protocol and liquidity. Mm-hmm. And what they can do with those tokens are then lock them up. They'll get VE Velo, and then you can directly vote for that pool every 7 days. Mm-hmm. So as that pool grows, they'll get higher and higher voting power, and essentially continue to kind of feed themselves Velo emissions and increase their vote share every week. So it's a couple different ways to utilize the flywheel. And I would say the most recent interesting thing that we've seen on Velodrome are some of our ecosystem pools. So what I mean by that are, wrapped ETH USDC, OP USDC or wrapped ETH. These pools sort of don't have a incentivization technique directly from, say, the OP Foundation or like the Ethereum Foundation. They're not incentivizing votes. Right. The way that these pools generate votes is 100% of the fees that those pools generate go to voters. So swap fees all go to voters as well. And, there's a lot of volume that's generated by these pools. So they naturally get votes, which increases the TVL for those pools as well. And we've seen a pretty large increase in our volume dominance on Optimism, even higher than, say, the Uniswap V3 now, because of the way that the Velodrome incentive designs works.
Great. Yeah, it's a wonderful insight there. I'd like to take a step back or two, from some of the more advanced mechanics and the engine of Velodrome, and I'd like to wrap up these shows with a question really more directed at someone who might be new to DeFi, someone who's trying to figure it all out, and what kinds of things you would say to that person. What does DeFi mean to you? These sorts of things.
Yeah, so I would say DeFi is one of those things that is most rewarding when you spend the time on educating yourself. It really is a commitment. It's when, for me personally, and I think for the majority of people, it's more meaningful and more impactful when you really understand what you're doing. There's a pretty significant disconnect between, I would say, the type of users who would buy a meme coin and just let it sit there and hopefully, it goes to 100 or 1,000x, and someone who's going to put like some of their checking account money into DeFi to try and yield farm, a USDC, USDT pool for 12% or whatever. I think the types of things you should really focus on are understanding kind of like what yield is, where does it come from? That's a question that I think everyone needs to understand, and it ends up like kind of translating back into TradFi concepts. Like I've learned a lot more about TradFi just because of DeFi and I guess finance in general. Find a mentor is definitely something that I would recommend. And if you don't know anyone directly in DeFi, immerse yourselves in kind of the crypto Twitter sphere or Reddit threads. That's also where I got a lot of my early education and inspiration with Reddit. It's obviously, it's hard to find kind of the quality content. It's always difficult to filter out. There's a lot of noise out there as well. It sort of makes sense after a while, like what's real and what you can tune out intuitively. That's sort of the first media I would recommend. And then, if you find something that's super interesting, The communities that have been developed in DeFi are really engaging, really education first, really helpful. You can go into a Discord and ask a question and probably get somebody to provide a thoughtful answer in under 10 minutes most of the time. And that's really the power of like this open finance system. There are no walled gardens. You don't have to wait on the phone with customer service to try and get an expert to help you. I think that that's one of the most empowering things is that it enables anyone to kind of be an expert and be creative to the point where the opportunities are really endless to be teachers or to learn from people anywhere around the world. So that's kind of where I would suggest getting started. And yeah, taking your time is absolutely an important thing to recommend too. It's like we mentioned before, it can be a steep learning curve, and I'm sure teams like Charged Particles and others are making this much more seamless and user friendly. But going slow is never a bad thing when you're doing something for the first time.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for the insight, Ace. I appreciate your time here on the show. I know from our side, we're really looking forward to our continued partnership with Charged Particles and Velodrome. And if you are a newer user to DeFi, Web3 Packs, which include some of Velodrome's tokens, are a great way to get broad exposure to, in this instance, the Mode ecosystem as a part of the larger Optimism superchain. So find out more about all of our projects, down below. And yeah, thank you so much again for joining me.
You got it, man. Thanks for having me, and best of luck on the launch on Mode.
Thanks very much.